Hello and welcome to the 2600 video. My name is JordanRudess from Kurzweil. I'm also the keyboardist for the group Dream Theater. The purpose of this video is to give you a basic overview of your new instrument and to get you up and running quickly. We'll cover some basic programming, create a sequence, and look at the major operational areas. This video is not intended to be a substitute for your manual. In fact, you may find it helpful to pause the video and refer to your manual as you watch. You'll also find it helpful if you watch the video if you're next to your 2600, so you can follow along on your own instrument. I also recommend that if you have access to the internet, that you visit our website at www.youngchang.com/Kurzweil. If you look in the customer support area on the site, you'll find many answers to many of the frequently asked questions, plus tutorials and other reference information. The video has been broken up into sections. To help you find these various sections, a number will be displayed in the upper left-hand corner, so you can fast forward to areas that most interest you. These numbers also correspond with the chapter titles printed on the video box. So let's get started. First, we'll give you a quick overview of the instrument. Looking at the front panel, you will notice that it is divided into sections. To the left of the display, or under the display in the case of the rack, is a row of 8 buttons. Pressing these buttons takes you to the 2600's 8 operational modes. The names of the modes are printed in white. Underneath, or to the side of this, you will notice that the buttons also have a blue label, and some of the buttons have an orange label. When you're editing a program and are in the program editor, then the blue labels apply to these buttons. When you're editing a sample within the sample editor, the orange labels apply. If you have the keyboard, then you also have 3 extra buttons under the mode buttons. These are dedicated to the sequencer, allowing you to start, stop, pause, and record, no matter which mode is currently shown in the display. Directly under the display is a row of 8 buttons. The edit and exit buttons are used to enter and exit the various editors found in the different modes. The middle 6 buttons are called soft buttons because their function changes according to where you are in the software menus. You'll notice 6 blocks at the bottom of the display. The blocks change names in relation to the function displayed on the screen. For instance, when you first turn on the 2600, you're in the program mode, and the soft buttons are used to transpose by octave, change MIDI channels, change the way programs are displayed, or send a MIDI all notes off message. If you have a rack version of the 2600 and just tried pressing these buttons, you may have noticed that pressing the octave plus or minus buttons had no effect. Don't worry, this is normal. We'll explain about this in just a moment. To the left of the display are the channel bank buttons. Although these buttons have different functions depending on which mode you're in, they always work in the same manner. When there are multiple pages which show the same thing, they'll move you through those pages. For example, in program and several other modes, they'll switch you through the 16 MIDI channels. In quick access mode, they switch to the different quick access banks. In song mode, they switch record tracks. And if you're editing programs or setups, then the green label under the button applies, switching you through layers in a program or zones in a setup. To the right of the display are buttons used for navigating and data entry. The 4 arrow buttons move the cursor around in the various edit screens and also scroll through programs and setups when in those modes. The wheel and the plus and minus buttons are used to scroll through the values of the various parameters, and the numeric keypad is used to directly enter specific values. If you have the keyboard, then you also have a section marked Assignable Controllers. There are 8 sliders with 8 buttons above them. The sliders can be used for real-time control of virtually any aspect of the sound. The sliders also have a special function when playing a KB3 program. KB3 programs are special programs which model the way a real Hammond B3 organ works. In this case, the 8 sliders work just like drawbars on a real Hammond, and the mod wheel is the 9th drawbar. buttons above the sliders have different uses depending on where you are in the instrument. When you're playing a KB3 program, then the labels above the buttons apply, allowing you to do things like turning on percussion, vibrato, and the rotary effect. In setup mode, the buttons will light for each zone used in the current setup. The light will be green if the zone is currently active. If you press a button, it will mute that zone and the light turns orange. You can easily change timbres by using these buttons. If you create a setup with many zones, you can quickly change your sound by simply muting and unmuting various zones to create different combinations. The sliders can be used to send any kind of controller message. As you play through the preset programs and setups, make sure to move the sliders to hear the variations you can create in the sound. To the left of the sliders is a button marked solo. This will solo the currently selected zone. The first time you press the button, it will solo zone 1. The zone button light will turn red. You can then solo any zone by pressing its button. Here I have layered 3 different sounds. By pressing the solo button, I can move back and forth between the different sounds and quickly switch my soloing sound. Below the solo button is the mix down button. This page lets you use the sliders to easily send MIDI volume or pan messages when you're working on a song. The third button on the left is called MIDI faders. This page allows you to create a preset configuration of any controller number assignment for each slider, along with an initial preset value for that controller. For each slider, you can assign the MIDI channel, controller number, and value. You can enter the value manually or use the slider to set the value. You can set several sliders to the same channel, but have each one assigned to a different controller number. There are 4 different configurations, which are called up by the soft buttons. Each configuration remembers the last value you set for each slider. If you want to send those values without moving the slider, press the Send button. Now let's talk about the other physical controllers on the keyboard. One of the first things you notice about the K2600 is the large ribbon controller placed above the keyboard. The ribbon senses movement when you press on it and when you move your finger up or down. The ribbon can be used as a single long strip, or if you want, it can be divided into 3 separate zones, each programmed to do something different. These zones are indicated by the 2 smaller arrows above the strip. There also is 1 large arrow directly to the center of the strip to give you a visual indication of the center point when you're using the ribbon as 1 long strip. One typical way you might use the ribbon is to bend pitch. This works especially great for lead programs. You will also notice a small ribbon controller located below the wheels. This ribbon is both pressure and movement sensitive, so it will respond to both my finger moving from side to side and from pressing down. You can program this ribbon so that it sends the same controller message for both pressure and movement, or you can program different messages. In this setup, I have the small ribbon set so that by pressing on it, I can control the amplitude, and by moving my finger back and forth, I can alter the pitch. This allows me to create a vibrato with the same type of technique that a string player would. two wheels are typical of what is found on many keyboards. The left one is normally used for pitch bend and springs back to center, while the right wheel is normally used as a standard mod wheel. Above the wheels are two buttons. These buttons can be set to momentary, so that they are only on while you press them, or they can be set to toggle, so that each time you press the button it turns on or off. In our preset programs and setups, they are often used to turn the arpeggiator on and off, and to change effects. Now let's look at the back of the instrument. You will find the typical power, MIDI, SCSI, and audio connections, along with the KDS port, which is used to connect to the optional DMTI using Kurzweil's proprietary digital format. There's also a knob for changing the display contrast. If you have the sampling option, you will see analog and digital sample input and digital output connectors. For keyboard owners, you will also see jacks for plugging in 4 switch pedals, 2 continuous controller pedals, and a breath controller. We'll be showing some examples of using these controllers later in the video. Let's take a moment to talk about the audio outs. You will see there are 10 configured as pairs labeled mix, A, B, C, and D. It's important to understand that even though there are 10 jacks, there are only 8 routable outs. Here's the way it works. When you route a signal, you choose the A, B, C, or D pairs in the appropriate panning position. For the purposes of following along with this video, you should have 2 cables plugged into either the mix outs or the A pair. I'll be explaining how to use multiple outs in the section on effects, so if you want to try that, you should plug cables into the A, B, C, and D pairs of outputs. Now let's jump in and start playing. We'll assume you know how to hook up MIDI in audio. If you aren't in program mode, go there by pressing the program button. If you have a rack, make sure your keyboard is transmitting on channel 1. Then check the upper right-hand corner of the 2600's display to see that it is on channel 1. If not, you can change it by using the channel bank buttons or the channel plus or minus soft buttons. By default, you will see the programs displayed as a list on the right side of the screen. You press the Master button, then the View button. You can switch the display to a larger view. If you go back to the program mode, you will see just one program name displayed in the large letters. This can be useful if you're performing on stage and want to see the program name from a distance. For now, let's return to the display to the regular list view. To scroll through different programs, you can use the wheel, the arrow buttons, or the plus and minus buttons. You can also call up a specific program by typing its number and pressing Enter. As you explore our preset programs, make sure to move the sliders in the mod wheel. You will find that we have programmed them so that all 8 sliders and the wheel will change some aspect of the sound. In general, the first 4 sliders and the wheel will change programming parameters, while the last 4 will change effect parameters. For example, in program 80, which is Poly-Reel Mini, slider A adds resonance to the filter. Slider B controls the filter cutoff. Slider C controls the attack time. Slider D controls release time and treble EQ. Slider E controls the wet-dry mix of the reverb. Slider F controls the decay time of the reverb. Slider G controls the amount of pre-delay in the reverb. And slider H controls the amount of the chorus delay effect. As you can see, by moving the sliders, you can have tremendous control over your sound. You will also want to try the mod wheel and the two buttons above it. In this program, the mod wheel adds vibrato. Switch button 1 turns on the arpeggiator. And switch 2 increases the amount of echo in the chorus delay effect. If you try this on your own keyboard and find that the sliders do not do the same things for this program that I have just described, go to the MIDI mode and check the control setup parameter on the MIDI transmit page. Make sure it's set to number 97, which is also called control setup. I'll talk more about this parameter later, but for now, just make sure it's set to number 97. As you scroll through the programs, you will find some with a caret character in between two names. For these programs, slider A will switch between two different sounds. For example, in program 74, with slider A down, you will hear new mutes, and with it up, you'll hear watt hour. Also, in most of our presets, slider E will control the overall wet-dry mix of the effects. For those of you who have the rack, if your keyboard doesn't have any assignable controllers, you may want to consider getting an extra controller, such as the K2600, which is assignable sliders, giving you the ability to send MIDI controller messages. If the Kurzweil is at its default settings, then slider 1 is assigned to MIDI controller number 6, and sliders 2 through 8 are set to controllers 22 through 28. A complete list of the preset programs and how control sources affect them is printed in the K2600 reference manual. There are actually 4 different types of programs, although 2 types are very similar. Regular programs can have up to 3 layers, and the left side of the display will show the name of the key map for each layer. Programs which have between 4 and 32 layers are called drum programs, but they do not have to have drum sounds in them. They can be made of any sound, but we call these programs drum programs because that is the typical use for a program with a lot of layers. When you scroll to a drum program, the left side of the display will show this and tell you how many layers there are in the program. Other than the number of layers, drum programs function identically to regular programs. The third type of program is entirely different. These are called KB3 programs, and they are special programs which emulate the way a real B3 organ works. You will find these programs between programs number 750 and 769. When you call up these programs, the sliders in the mod wheel function differently than they do for regular programs. The 8 sliders function like the first 8 drawbars on a B3, and the mod wheel functions as the 9th drawbar, just like on a real organ. Moving the sliders down towards you brings up the volume for that partial, and pushing it up brings the volume down, which is the opposite of the way a slider would typically be programmed in a synthesizer. The only exception to this is the mod wheel, which still works the same, adding volume as you bring up the mod wheel. The buttons above the sliders access other standard B3 functions, such as adding percussion and turning on the chorus vibrato effect. One thing to be aware of with KB3 programs is that in order to emulate the way a real organ works, the Kurzweil grabs a specific number of voices as soon as you call up the KB3 program, and those voices are reserved for the KB3 program, whether or not you're playing any notes. You can determine the number of voices used by setting the number of tone wheels in the program when you edit it. All of the preset KB3 programs are designed so that they use 40 of your 48 voices of polyphony. So typically, when you're using a KB3 program, you'll probably be playing it by itself, or maybe split in a setup with a bass program. But you should not expect to be able to sequence with a KB3 program and have a lot of polyphony left for other tracks. The fourth kind of program is a live mode program. To use live mode, you must first have the sampling option and sample RAM installed in your instrument. Live mode programs are actually just like regular VAST programs, with one exception. Instead of using the preset ROM samples, or samples you load into RAM for the source of the sound, you can process anything that comes into the sample input through both the VAST synthesis engine and the effects. This allows you to use the Kurzweil as a real-time synth and effects processor for external signals. To use live mode, you first need to have something plugged into an analog sample input. I'm going to be using a guitar. Next, you need to turn live mode on. Press the sample mode soft button. Make sure that the source is set to external and input is set to analog. Now, scroll down to the mode and set it to live in. Now you can use the gain parameter to adjust the amount of input signal. The sample input on the K2600 is line level, so if you're running a signal from a microphone or a guitar, you'll either want to run it into a preamp or mixer first, or else bring the gain parameter up. You will find the preset live mode programs located between 740 and 749. I'll call up program 746, which is live mode paraflange. So I have the guitar running through a parametric EQ, which I can control with slider A, and the mod wheel, and a flange effect, which I can control with slider B. In order for a live mode program to actually send the live input through the Kurzweil, you have to strike a note on the keyboard. So I'll strike C4 and hold it with the sustain pedal. Here's another example using a tube distortion. The 2600 is 16-channel multi-timbral. That means you can have a different program on each channel. You can see what program is on each channel by using the channel bank buttons or the channel soft buttons. You can easily call up a specific program for a MIDI channel by going to that channel and picking the program you want. But if you have the rack, keep in mind that you may be looking at channel 2, but if you are sending from your keyboard on channel 1, you may still be hearing the program that is on channel 1. I'll show you how to change this in the next section. You can play any program on any channel, with one exception. The KB3 programs can only be played in a single MIDI channel. You choose this channel with the organ channel parameter on the master mode. If you are in a different MIDI channel and you scroll to a KB3 program, you will see it displayed in parentheses and it will not sound. Now, let's take a look at setup mode. Setup mode allows you to take up to 8 programs on 8 different MIDI channels and split or layer them in zones across the keyboard. If you call up a setup which uses 3 zones or less, then the left part of the display will show the programs for each zone. Lines under the program name show where each zone is laid out on the keyboard. In this setup, you can see that School Base is assigned to the left side of the keyboard, and FMish ePiano and Dyn ePiano are layered on the right. You can also see the MIDI channel for each zone. If the setup has more than 3 zones, then you will still see the lines showing in the keyboard layout, but the program names are not displayed. Before we proceed any further, we need to talk about one parameter which will be important if you have the rack module. It's called Local Keyboard Channel, and it's found on the MIDI Receive page. To get to it, press the MIDI Mode button, then the soft button labeled Receive. You will need to use this parameter if you want to use setup mode. It is important to understand that a setup is designed to transmit information. On the keyboard version of the 2600, the keyboard itself will transmit on up to 8 channels when in setup mode. But with the rack, if your keyboard only sends information on one MIDI channel, you need a way to turn that information on one channel into 8 channels. This is what the local keyboard channel parameter does. It takes the signal coming in one channel and turns it into different information, depending on where you are in the 2600. To demonstrate, set local keyboard channel to 1, and then send from your keyboard on channel 1. Now, go back to setup mode, and let's look at our setup again. The information coming in on channel 1 from your keyboard stays on channel 1, or is turned into channel 2 and 3, depending on where I play on the keyboard. It's important to understand that the local keyboard channel will change the way the 2600 performs in other modes as well. It changes the incoming information depending on what you have displayed in the 2600. For instance, if you're in program mode with channel 5 in the display, then the information coming in on channel 1 will be turned into channel 5, and you will hear the program assigned to channel 5. But if you turn local keyboard channel off by setting it to none, then if you send on channel 1, you will hear the program that is assigned to channel 1, even if you are looking at channel 5. Local keyboard does more than just change the MIDI channel. You will notice that the octave plus and minus soft buttons now will transpose the information. And you can even use it to change one type of MIDI controller to another. For more information on this, consult your manual. Once again, I want to point out that this parameter is normally used only by rack owners. If you have the keyboard, you should leave the local keyboard channel set to none. Now, let's take a look at some of the things you can do with the setup. I've already shown you a setup using a basic splitting and layering. Here is one of my performance setups that I use in the Rudess Morgenstein project, with many different programs laid out across the keyboard, and a surprise on the ribbon. For each zone in a setup, you can assign any controller to send any message you want. You can even use the same slider to send up to 8 different messages by assigning a different controller number to each zone. Here is a setup which has 5 zones, each using the same string program, but with each zone transposed to a different octave. By assigning each slider to control volume for one zone, I can constantly change the timbre of the string ensemble. Now let's look at some cool things you can do with the ribbons. One typical use is to use it to control pitch, which is the default setting when you're playing programs, but it can be used for many other things. Here I've used the big ribbon to crossfade between 3 different zones. I've used a different curve for each zone. One is set to crossfade, one to reverse crossfade, and the third to bump, so each spot on the ribbon gives a different mix of the three programs. You can also trigger notes from the ribbon, as well as other controllers. So I can play harp arpeggios on the ribbon while playing another sound on the keyboard. Another thing you can do in a setup is control the arpeggiator. The arpeggiator takes notes that you play on the keyboard and turns them into arpeggiated patterns. In the next setup, I have one of the Latin percussion programs set to arpeggiate, which creates all different kinds of percussive grooves as I play on the keyboard. I can hold the groove with the pedal and then play notes over that groove. In this setup, I'm bringing in the volume of the arpeggiated sound with the ribbon. A setup allows you to call up a song when you select that setup. This is great for performance. You can simply call up the setup you want, and it will call up one of your songs, and at the same time, you call up the programs that you want to play live from the keyboard. At that point, you can press the dedicated play button, or if you have a rack, press the left and right cursor buttons together, and the song will start playing, and you can play along with it. The K2600 also contains some special groove template setups, which we created by using the ability to trigger songs from keys. You'll learn about this in the song mode section of this video. This allows you to have an automatic accompaniment pattern which will switch keys as you play different notes with your left hand while playing a melody with your right hand. We hope that these examples have given you some ideas about the many capabilities that you have with setups in the 2600. In the next section, we'll show you how to build a simple setup. Let's make our own setup. It's easy to do. We're going to make a setup with two programs layered on the right side of the keyboard and another program on the left side. Go to Setup 99. That's the default setup. Now press Edit. When you first enter the setup editor, you'll be on the Channel Program page. Let's assign program number 14, which is Suitcase E-Piano, to the first zone. Notice it's assigned to channel 1 and the destination is set to local and MIDI. The most important thing to remember about setups is that each zone must be on a separate channel because you can only have one program on a channel at a time. The exception to this would be if you assigned one zone to local only and another zone to MIDI only. One other exception would be if you wanted the same program in more than one zone. For example, you could take a program and assign it to two zones, but then transpose one zone an octave up, allowing you to play the two octaves of the same sound. But more often than not, you'll want to have a separate channel for each zone. Now, we'll add another zone. Press the left More button 3 times till you see the new zone, and press it. Notice that the upper right-hand corner now shows that you're on zone 2 of 2. Notice also that the 2600 automatically picked channel 2 for this zone, since it assumes that you want to use a different channel. Let's assign program number 107, big strings, flange strings, to this zone. Now the two programs are layered. Remember that we said earlier, if the program name has two different names separated by the caret character, then moving slider A will switch between the two programs. But when I move the slider, the program stays in the big string sound. This is because now that you're in the setup mode, that slider is not assigned to the correct controller number. We'll change this later. But for now, let's adjust the relative volumes of each zone. Press the right More button 3 times. Then, press the Pan Volume button. On this page, we can set initial volume and pan settings. We'll set the volume of Zone 2 to 110. That will lower the strings a little bit. If you want to set the volume of Zone 1, press either Channel Bank button. Now, the display will show Zone 1 of 2. You can use the pan parameter to set a pan position for each layer. This sends controller number 10 on the MIDI channel of the zone. Notice that there is both an entry value and an exit value for each function. You'll find entry and exit values on all of the other pages involving physical controllers, except for the pitch wheel. This is an extremely useful feature. This allows you to send a specific value for that controller when you enter or leave the setup. For example, let's say that in this setup we want Zone 1 panned hard left. We choose a value of 0 for the entry value. Now we have set MIDI channel 1 to be panned hard left. If you were to go to a different setup, which includes channel 1, and it doesn't have an entry pan setting, it will still be panned hard left. But if we choose a value of 64 for the exit pan, then when we leave this setup, channel 1 will be back center panned. For now, we'll put the pan back in the center. Now let's create the third zone of our setup. Press the left More button until you get back to the New Zone button and press it. Next, press the Write More button 3 times. And then press the Key Velocity Soft button. Since we're going to split zone 3 from the other two zones, I'll set the high note to B2. Next, I will switch to zone 1 and set it from C3 to C8. A good way to set the note range is to hold the Enter key underneath the numeric keypad, and while holding it, press the note that you'd like selected. So I'll press B2. Now I'll do the same thing for zone 2. Hold the Enter key, press the note. Now, press the Channel Program button. Scroll to zone 3 and select program number 32, Ricken Bass. Now, press the Key Velocity button. Notice the low velocity and high velocity parameters. These allow you to set a range of velocities in which to trigger a zone. By using these parameters, you can create setups which switch sounds according to the velocity, or add an additional sound when you reach a certain velocity. You also see the transpose parameter. For this setup, we're going to change the bass to play an octave higher. So scroll to zone 3, then highlight the transpose parameter and set it to 12 semitones. Finally, we'll set some of the physical controllers for our setup. Press the Write More button once, then press Foot Switch. Here we can assign the controller setting for the 4 switch pedals. The switch type allows you to set whether the pedal is momentary, which is the way a sustain pedal works, or toggle, in which case each time you press the pedal, it turns on or off and stays that way till you press the pedal again. If the switch type is set to momentary or toggle, then the destination can be any MIDI controller number. In addition, there are several special functions you can assign. For instance, you could start and stop a song, advance to the next setup, transpose the song a specific amount, or even mute a zone. You can also set the pedal to trigger a specific note. Note M is momentary and only triggers the note while you are holding the pedal, while note T is a toggle, so the note stays triggered until you press the pedal again. Notice that if the switch type is set to note, then the destination parameter changes from a MIDI controller value to a note number. The on and off parameters let you set the value of the controller number, which will be sent when you turn the pedal on and off. If the pedal is set to send a note, then these parameters are the attack and release velocities that are sent. Finally, you see that just like on the volume pan page, you can set entry and exit values. You will also find these same parameters on the switch page, which is used for the 2 buttons above the mod wheel and pitch wheel. Remember that each zone can have a separate value for each controller. In this case, I want to use the sustain pedal to only sustain the layered sounds, not the bass. So since the default setup already has sustain assigned to pedal 1, I'll scroll to zone 3 and set the destination to off. For the next step in creating our setup, we'll assign different sliders to control the volume for each zone. Press the slider button. This gives you access to the first 4 sliders. If you want to use the second 4 sliders, you'll find them under Slider 2 button. Take a look at the various parameters. Since all the continuous controllers work in a similar manner, you'll find these same parameters on the control pedal, ribbon, wheel, and pressure pages. Once again, the destination lets you choose any MIDI controller or a special function. I'm going to zone 1, and I'll set the slider B to volume. The scale parameter lets you control how sensitive the slider is to being moved. First, we'll solo this zone, zone 1, and set the scale parameter to 200%. With this, it would go from 0 to full value when you move from the bottom to only halfway up. Or, if it was set to 50%, then the slider would only get up to half of full value even when the slider was moved all the way up. I'll leave this set to 100%. The add parameter allows you to add or subtract a specific amount to the normal values of the slider. For instance, if you set this to 45, then the lowest amount the slider would go would be 45. You could use this so that you could move the slider all the way down, but still have some volume for that zone. The curve parameter allows you to change the way that the slider responds as you move it. Check the diagrams in your manual to see how the different curves really work. Finally, we once again see the entry and exit values. Now that I have zone 1 set, I'll go to zone 2 and assign volume to slider C. You can simply press 7 and enter, a little shortcut to get to volume. Keep in mind that the initial volume levels I set on the volume pan page will still be set when I first call up the setup. But then I can use the sliders to adjust volumes for the zone in real time. Also, remember that for each zone, you can assign any of the sliders. So if you want to have a single slider controlling the piano and string sounds together, you can easily do that by assigning volume to the same slider in those two zones. Now let's go back to zone 2 and assign slider A to data. You can press 6 and enter. This is the default value for slider A when you're in program mode. Now, when you move that slider, it'll switch the string sound between big strings and flange strings. Finally, we'll choose our effects for the setup. Press the Write More button twice. Then, press the KD Effects button. The first parameter on the screen is the studio. A studio is a single object which consists of multiple effects and EQs, plus signal and output routing. We'll go into great detail on the studio later in the video, but for now, I want to show you an easy way to assign different effects from the preset studios. Select Studio number 3. Take a look at the name. The 2600 has 4 separate effects buses, plus a global auxiliary effect. For all of the preset studios in the instrument, we have named them so that you can tell what the various effects are in the studio. In this studio, there's a room reverb on effects bus 1, a chorus on effects bus 2, and a chorus delay reverb multi-effect on effects bus 3. On effects bus 4, we have no effect assigned to it, which is indicated by the space between CDR and Hall. In our preset studios, we typically leave effects bus 4 set to no effect so that you always have one dry bus to choose from if you need it. Finally, a Hall reverb is assigned as the auxiliary effect. Now, press the left More button 3 times and press the Channel Program Soft button. Move the cursor to highlight the Out parameter. Currently, it says Prog, which stands for Program. This means that the output setting for each layer in a program is used. But you can override those settings from the setup, which means you can easily choose the effects for the individual programs in your setup without having to go back and edit the programs. Let's set Zone 1 to KDFX B. This will give it some chorus on the piano. Zone 2 we'll set to KDFX C, and that will add the chorus delay reverb to the strings. And Zone 3 to KDFX A. This will assign the room reverb to the bass. Now we're ready to save our setup. Press the left More button 4 times. Then press Name. You see the name of the original program, Default Setup. Let's name our setup E Piano Trio. There are 2 ways you can name things in the 2600. The first way is to use the numeric keypad. Each number has letters printed in green under the button. Each time you press the button, it cycles through those letters. Use the plus/minus button to change from upper to lower case. The left and right arrow buttons, along with the 2 arrow soft buttons, are used to move the cursors across the screen. You can use the delete button to erase characters, and insert will insert a space. The second way to name is to use your keyboard. Notice that in the upper right-hand corner it says Keyboard Naming, and that it's turned to off. To turn it on, press the Channel Bank Up button. Now the different keys on the keyboard are assigned to different characters. If you look on your manual in Chapter 5 in the section of Saving, you'll find a chart that shows which key is assigned to which character. Pressing the Channel Bank Up button again puts keyboard naming in advanced mode. This is described in detail in the manual. Once you get used to keyboard naming, you may find you can name items much quicker this way. So, I'll finish naming this setup by pressing the correct keys. We'll call it Trio. Once you have named the setup, press OK. Now press Save. The 2600 will choose the first blank number to save into. You can actually choose any number you want to save in. If a program already exists in the number you choose, the display changes to show the program in that location and asks if you want to replace it. For now, let's just save it to a blank location. You can press the plus and minus keys together under the wheel to get to the first available location, and then you can rotate back to replace by hitting them again. So let's save it to the first available, and I'll hit Save. Now I'll exit out, and it's saved. Congratulations, you've just created your first setup. We'll take a look at one more setup. Press the MIDI mode button. If the top line of the display does not say Transmit, press the Transmit Soft button. The first parameter on this page is called the Control Setup. We've already seen that you use the Setup Editor to allow you to set the various controllers to send specific messages. But what about when you're playing in program mode? The Control Setup parameter allows you to choose a setup which will determine the behavior of all the physical controllers while you're playing programs. For example, let's say you want to use a continuous controller pedal for volume control. Highlight the Control Setup parameter, and press Edit. Now, press the right More button once. Then press the C pedal soft button. Now assign volume to the C pedal 1 destination. And you can do that by pressing 7 on the numerical keypad and pressing Enter. Now press Exit. At this point, the 2600 takes me to the Save screen. I can rename the setup if I want, but for now, I'll just press Yes, and then Save. Now, I'm returned to the control setup parameter, and the Kurzweil has automatically selected my new setup for the control setup. Now, as long as I'm playing programs, I can use my pedal for controlling volume. Unless you make your own control setup, you'll normally want to leave this parameter set to number 97, which has a setup with all the default assignments for the sliders and other controllers. If you're in program mode and your sliders or pedals or any other controllers don't seem to work correctly, check this parameter and make sure it's set to number 97, or one that you've created. If you do make your own control setup, you should remember that the preset programs have been programmed so that they respond to the specific controller numbers assigned to the sliders and other controllers in setup number 97. So, if you change those assignments, you won't have the real-time control over those things we've programmed. And other controllers in setup number 97. So, if you change those assignments, you won't have the real-time control over those things we've programmed. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at the quick access mode. This mode was designed especially for performance purposes, but it can also be useful in the studio. When you go to quick access mode, you will notice a list of 10 names. These can either be names of programs or setups. Notice that they are laid out the same way the numeric keypad is laid out. By pressing a button on the numeric keypad, you can call up the program or setup that relates to that button. So, you have immediate access to any 10 programs or setups with only one button press. This group of 10 is called a quick access bank. You can have up to 255 banks. The name and number of the bank is on the top line. You can use the channel bank buttons to move through the different banks. You can also go directly to a bank by pressing either the plus, minus, or the clear button on the numeric keypad. You can then type in the bank number and hit OK or Enter. Creating your own bank is simple. Just press Edit. The first parameter you see is entry. This is the number on the numeric keypad that you will assign the program or setup to. You can scroll through each entry with the channel bank buttons. The next parameter lets you select a program or a setup. Scroll once to the left and we'll choose Setup. Scroll back to the right and you can choose which setup you want for this entry. And that's really all there is to it. As you can see, there are soft buttons for naming and saving the bank. The procedure is the same as before. Quick access banks are great to use if you're performing and need to be able to quickly get a specific group of programs and setups. Or if you're sequencing in the studio and want to be able to audition a group of similar sounding programs. You can assign them to one QA bank and then switch easily between them while you run your sequence. Within the K2600 song mode, you'll find a full-featured sequencer. For those of you who have never used a sequencer, it functions much like a tape recorder does. But instead of recording sound, it records events. When you play back the sequence, the 2600 recreates those events, and the instrument is played just as if you were playing notes yourself in real time. And of course, since this information has been recorded digitally, you can go back and edit individual events to change your performance or fix mistakes. When you first go to song mode, you'll be on song 1, new song. If you're not on that song, change to it. Let's look at the main song page. Along the bottom, you'll see a row of 16 tracks. Along with the MIDI channels assigned to those tracks, we've logically assigned track 1 to MIDI channel 1, track 2 to channel 2, etc. However, you can assign any MIDI channel you want to any track. You can even have more than one track assigned to the same channel. But keep in mind that you can only have one program on a channel at a time. So in that case, both tracks would be playing the same program. To record our first track, we'll set the record track to 1 and call up a bass program. We'll set the tempo to 200. Hit enter. Press the Miss Soft button. Set the record mode to linear and play mode to loop. There are different ways of recording your data, and we'll be exploring the various record modes. Linear recording is just like recording to tape. We can record as long as we want until the memory runs out. Check that count off is set to 1, and click is set to record. This will give us a 1-bar count off before recording starts, and we'll hear the click when recording, but not when playing back. Now, press Main to get back to the main page. In the upper right-hand corner, the 2600 displays the song status, which is stopped right now. Press the Record button. Notice the display flashes Record Ready. When you hit play, the 2600 will count off 4 beats since we designated a 1-bar count off, and then begin recording. When you're done, the 2600 asks you if you want to save. You can name your song here as well. We'll go ahead and save it. Now I'm going to make some changes to the track I just recorded. First, I'm going to quantize it. Quantization is a tool which allows you to move notes forward and backwards in time so that they line up with the grid. With this technique, if you've played in something and the rhythm isn't very accurate, you can go back and make it accurate. Press Edit to go into the song editor. There are several different types of editors. When you first enter the editor, you're on the Common page. This contains parameters such as tempo and time signature, which affect all tracks. Now, press Track. This brings you into the track editor. In this editor, there are a variety of functions which can be applied to a specific track for a given range of measures. The upper right-hand corner shows you which track you're currently editing. You can change tracks with the Channel Bank buttons. With function highlighted, scroll to quantize. Notice the boxed area on the right. This is called the Region Criteria window. You will find this for all track editing functions. It's where you set the range of measure that you want to edit, along with other criteria such as selecting notes in a certain key range or certain controllers. Since we have just entered the editor, it is set to edit from the beginning of the song till our current endpoint. And to edit the entire range of notes, we'll leave these parameters set at their defaults. On the left side of the page, you see the parameters specific to quantization. The quantization parameter lets you choose how much quantization applies. At 100%, the notes will be moved all the way to the grid point. If you choose an amount less than 100%, well, then the notes will be moved only partway according to the percentage. Grid lets you define the note value that you want to use. I'm going to quantize to eighth notes. You can quantize to any possible note value. A shortcut to getting eighth notes is to press 8, enter, and 16th notes would be 16, enter. In this case, we'll do eighths. To jump quickly through the standard values, you can also highlight the parameter and the plus and minus buttons. Let's go back to eighths, 8, and enter. The swing and shift parameters allow you to further change the way the notes are moved. 0% swing is straight time, and 100% produces a triplet feel. Shift lets you move the notes forward or backwards by a specific amount. Once you have set the parameters the way you want, press Go. The 2600 carries out the edit. Now we can play the song to hear the change. Just press the Play Soft button and listen to the difference. You can press Stop, and if you like what you hear, you can hit Exit, and then save your changes. Hit Yes, and replace. For our next track, we're going to record some drums. We'll be using the loop record method. Loop record works similarly to the way you would create a pattern on a drum machine. You set a length for your loop, then each time the 2600 goes through the loop, it adds what you're playing to the previously recorded information. The length of the loop is determined by the endpoint. Our endpoint is now set at the point where we press stop on our first track. We want to set our endpoint so that we can record an exact 8-bar loop. To set a new endpoint, press the Event Soft button. First you have to hit Edit, and then Event. The event editor will list every single event in the track. You can scroll through the track and change individual things such as note numbers, velocity, and durations. You can use the wheel, you can use the arrows. This is great for fixing a wrong note or other small mistakes. As you scroll, you'll also hear the events. Notice that at the beginning of the track, you'll find program and bank changes along with initial volume and pan controller amounts. One trick I use to get to the beginning is I just hit 1, 1 on the numerical keypad and enter. It takes you right to the top. The 2600 creates these events when you first record the track. Scroll to the end of the track to change the endpoint. Another trick I use is I just hit a bunch of 9s, 99999, and then hit enter, and it automatically takes you to the end. Or you can scroll using the wheel. Since I'm making an 8-bar loop, I'll scroll over one parameter and type 91000 and then enter. Now we've set our endpoint. When you're done, then you can exit and save. Since I've made changes to the track, the 2600 is always going to ask if you want to save it. And of course, you'll say yes and replace. Now I'll record my drum track. Set the record track to 2. You can use the channel bank buttons or scroll over to where it says record track. And call up a drum program. Go back to the miss page and set the record mode to loop. I'm also going to set this track for input quantization. You can actually quantize during the recording process by setting the quantization parameters on this page instead of quantizing in the editor after the fact. Once again, I'm going to choose eighth notes and 100% quantization. Now, return to the main page. Make sure that the mode is set to merge. This way it will add what you record each time it runs through your loop. If mode is set to erase, then each time you record in the loop, it will replace what was there previously. If you make a mistake while recording in loop mode, you can erase an individual note by holding the Enter button and striking the note you want erased during the point in time you want to erase the note. add some percussion. No, not that. So I'll hold down Enter and get rid of that on the loop. So that's gone. Now I'll add, I think it's maybe here. Ah, yes. You can try some other things. If you don't like it, you hold down Enter. Gets rid of it. Oh, there's one more. But we can leave that. I'll hit stop. It's a little guest appearance by the cowbell. So now, we'll hit save, and we've got our 2 tracks. Next thing I want to do is record a comping part for track 3. For this part, I don't want to do input quantization, so I'll go back and set that to 0%. Also, I want to set this for unloop record mode. Unloop allows you to record a track that is longer than the original loop while it continues to loop the other tracks. So in this case, I'm going to record 16 bars. After the 8th bar, the drums and bass will loop back to the beginning while my comping part records in a linear mode for all 16 bars. One of the tricks I do is to hit stop right before the next beat, which automatically sets the end point for the proper place. Now we'll show another example of track editing. Go back into the track editor and scroll to change. To do that, we hit Edit, but if you're on the program, it'll go into the program, which is a good feature. So make sure you're on something like the record track and hit Edit. Hit the track button, and now we can scroll to change. This allows you to modify or scale note velocities or the values of a specific controller. We'll scale the velocities on track 3 to 80%. You can use the offset parameter to add or subtract a specific amount. When the mode parameter is set to constant, it will affect all the notes in the range equally. You can set it to a positive or negative ramp, so that the change occurs gradually from the start point to the end point of your defined range. For example, you could scale back the velocities of a 4-bar phrase using a negative ramp to create a decrescendo. I'll leave it on constant, and I'll hit go. The machine will think for a second, and now let's hear what it sounds like at 80%, track 3. Very funky. Next, we'll record another track. So we'll exit out, we'll do a save, replace, yes, and I'll go to track 4, and I'll pick a sound I want. Good. And we'll make sure that we're not quantizing, because the lead doesn't necessarily need to be. Back to main. I'll hit record. We're still in unloop mode, so I can really go on and play the lead as long as I like. So here we go. Stop trick, hit yes, replace, let's see what we got. Take the volume of the lead down a little. One neat trick is you can actually change something like volume by pressing the record button, and while it's waiting to be recorded instead of just playing, I could change the volume, in this case of the lead, down to 100 and hit stop, and that puts in a new volume. So when I hit play, that's much more reasonable. I'm going to show one more example of the track editor. Hit Edit, go to Track, and we'll scroll the function to Erase. We're going to set the events to mono pressure. If your keyboard has mono pressure and was set to transmit it, you may have recorded a lot of pressure events into your sequence. If the sounds you're playing do not utilize the pressure, then these events waste a lot of memory. So we'll get rid of them. Instead of erasing the pressure from just one track, I want to do it from all the tracks. So what you can do is press the channel bank buttons together, both of them, give them one shot, and you can see in the top right it says All. Now it's set to erase mono pressure. I hit Go, it does it, and then we can exit out, hit Yes, and mono pressure is gone. Now let's take a look at the mixer page. As you can see, this page resembles the layout of a mixing board. You can set initial levels for each track or record changes in real time. You can play the song and change the levels and pan position for various tracks. In addition, you can mute individual tracks using the 8 mode buttons. You can access all 16 tracks by switching from 1 through 8 or 9 through 16. The muting is temporary and is in effect only while on the mixer page. Once you have the settings you desire, you can press Keep to update the initial volume and pan settings found at the beginning of the track. If you want to record changes in real time, then you would record while on the mixer page and make your changes. Next, we'll take a look at the Arrange feature. I'm going to call up a song in which I've already created an arrangement. You can start with a new song again. Now press Edit, and then Arrange. On this page, you can take various songs and string them together to form an arrangement. This is extremely useful for saving memory. The 2600 has a limitation of 64K for any object except a sample. If you have a long and complex song, you can break it up into sections and save each section as a separate song. Then you can use the Arrange editor to put the sections together. If you have a section that repeats, you don't need to save it twice. You can have the Arrange editor play it twice. Let's look at the parameters on this page. Each part of the arrangement is called a step. For each step, you assign a song. I have song number 300 for the first step. As I scroll through the steps, you can see the song assigned to each step. To add new steps, you can press the Add button. You can delete a step with the Delete button. For each step, you can choose to mute individual tracks. In this way, you could assign the same song to 2 steps, but mute different tracks in each step. Then when you play the arrangement, you will hear 2 different sections, even though they were using the same song. You can also transpose a step and have it repeat any number of times. One great feature is that you can trigger steps from various keys and then play along with them, so you can spread your different sequences across the keyboard and trigger them in any order you want to create arrangements in real time. As you can see, I've assigned the first song from C1 to G1, the second song from C2 to G2, etc. Since the song is assigned to a group of keys, as I play up and down the keyboard, the entire sequence will be transposed. However, I don't want the drums to transpose, since they would end up playing different drums assigned to those other keys. To prevent this from happening, you tell the 2600 that a specific track is a drum track so that it will not respond to transposition. You can set this parameter on the common page in the editor. So if I go to song 300, and we look inside the editor, you will see that tracks 2 and 3 are set as drum tracks. There is one last parameter you need to set to trigger songs from keys. I'll go back to my arrangement song and press Edit. Notice the parameter called Trigger Channel. I have this set to MIDI channel 7. I've called up a lead sound on channel 7, and when I play the notes I have assigned to trigger the steps, the song plays without playing the lead sound. But when I play any other notes, you hear that lead. Now we'll take a look at Kurzweil's unique RAM tracks feature. This feature allows you to record a sample while your sequence is playing. The Kurzweil will automatically create a program to play your sample and place it in your sequence so that playback of the sample is synced correctly to your song. You will need to have the sampling option in your unit to take advantage of this feature. I'll start by calling up a song which has some basic rhythm section tracks. Now, I'm going to record a guitar part to add to the song. Go to the Program mode, and then press Sample to get to the sampling page. Make sure that Input is set to Analog, and Source is set to External. Next, set the sampling time for enough seconds to record what you need. Of course, the maximum amount of time you can choose will depend on how much sample RAM you have in your instrument. I'll turn the monitor parameter to on so I can hear what I'm playing through the Kurzweil. Then I'll set the mode parameter to mono left since I'm recording from a mono source. Next, I have to adjust the gain parameter so that I have a good signal coming into the Kurzweil. A little hotter. The level meters show the level of the signal. As in any recording, you want to get the signal as close to 0 dB as possible without pinning the meters. The next thing that I'll do is set the threshold so that it doesn't actually begin sampling until it reaches a level that's above the level that I set. So in this case, I can see that the level is reaching -4 dB, but I'll set the threshold for -24. That way, as soon as it goes over that, we'll begin the sampling process. In order for the RAM tracks feature to work, the song must be playing before the actual sampling begins. If you want to start sampling from the beginning of the first bar of music, then make sure that you have the click parameter set to count off so that you get a count off before the song starts playing. If you have a keyboard, you can simply press the dedicated play button. For those of you with a rack, pressing the left and right cursor buttons together will start the current song. Now I'll press record in the sample mode, but it will actually wait to begin sampling until I exceed the threshold limit. Once I've done that, I can press play and begin my performance. Once you finish recording, You can press stop to stop sampling, or if you run out of sampling time, the Kurzweil will stop automatically. This also stops the song playback as well. Now the Kurzweil asks you to strike a key to set the sample route, or you can press default to set it to C4. Next, the Kurzweil will give you a display showing you the maximum level signal or number of clips. You want to see a maximum level fairly close to 0 dB to have a good quality signal, or one with relatively few clips. Press yes, and the Kurzweil takes you to the standard saving dialog where you can name and save the sample. Although we always recommend that you name all of your objects to help make it easy to keep track of them, for now, we'll just save with the default name of new sample. Now the Kurzweil asks you if you want to place the sample in the song. So we press yes. Next, you're allowed to pick which track you want to use for playback of this RAM track. The first time you record a RAM track, you should pick an unused track, because the Kurzweil will be creating a program to play back the sample, and that program needs to be on its own MIDI channel. Finally, the Kurzweil asks you to strike a key which will be used to play back the sample. This key is different than the root key. It's the key number used to actually trigger the event in the sequence. The Kurzweil makes sure that the sample plays back at the right pitch, regardless of which trigger key you select. Now, if you go to the song and scroll to the track you chose, you will see that there is a new program assigned to that track. Since I did not choose a new name when I saved the sample, the program is called newSample, which is the same name of the sample object. This track will have a note event in it, which triggers the sample to play back correctly so that it's in time with the song. You can continue recording more RAM tracks. Once you've recorded the first RAM track, you can choose the same song track to use for your additional RAM track. In fact, each song track can have up to 32 RAM tracks. This is because the Kurzweil will put each sample on its own separate layer in the program, and a program can have up to 32 layers. You can then go back and edit each layer to assign any vast programming and further alter your RAM track. You can also choose different song tracks for each RAM track, in which case each sample will end up on its own program. One final thing you should know about RAM tracks. Because there is no way to actually sync sample playback to MIDI, if you have a sample which plays back over a long period of time, it can drift in relation to MIDI events. You can have up to a half millisecond of drift per minute. So for this reason, you're better off recording your RAM tracks in several shorter phrases rather than a simple long sample. There is one final step to working with a song, and that is to add effects. But before we show you how to do this, you need to learn a little bit more about how the effects work in the K2600. In the next section, we'll cover the basics of KD effects and then come back afterwards to show you how to use effects with a song. Now let's take a close look at the KDFX Studio. Press the Effects Mode button. As we saw previously, you can call up a studio from within a program or a setup, but it's also possible to select a studio on the main effects page. Let's take a minute to define what a studio is. There's a very good reason we have called this object a studio, and that is because it really follows the concept of a recording studio environment. For those of you who have experience in working in a recording studio, you'll find the following to be familiar. Imagine that you have a mixing board with 4 stereo input channels, or they can be even configured as 8 mono inputs, or a combination in between. For each channel input, you have 2 EQs. For each channel, you also have 2 effect sends. Now, over in a rack on the side, you have 4 stereo effect processors, plus an additional effects processor that can be used as a global effects processor. Finally, you have an audio patch bay that lets you route a signal from anywhere in the chain to any specific output jack. As you can see from looking at this graphic, editing a studio allows you to choose how you want to route a signal. Set EQ and effects and send it to a specific output. Now, take a look at the display of the 2600. The first 2 parameters are effects mode and effects channel. These parameters are important to understand because they determine how the studio is controlled. Remember that even though you can have multiple effects, they are accessed from a studio, and only a single studio can be active at one time. So you use the effects mode parameter to choose what will control the studio. The default value is auto. This means that whichever mode you're currently in is controlling the effects. Each program and setup has a studio assigned to it. So if you go to program mode and call up a program, the studio assigned to the program on the KDFX page in the program editor will be called up. For example, if we go to program mode, call up number 1, and then go back to effects mode, you'll see that the studio number is 49. If you go back to program mode, call up number 20, and then go back to the effects. You'll see number 181. The same would apply for setups. The effects mode parameter works in conjunction with the effects channel. The default value for this is current. This means that the program assigned to the MIDI channel currently in the display is in control of the effects. But you can also set this to a specific channel. For example, you could set it so that the program on channel 1 is in control of the studio. As we mentioned, in auto, either a program or a setup can be in control, depending on which mode you're in. You can also set this parameter to setup or program only. The final value is master. When set to master, the studio that you call up on this page will be the one that you hear, no matter what program you call up. In this situation, the effects channel parameter is meaningless. For practical purposes, you'll normally want to leave effects mode set to auto and effects channel set to current. That way, no matter where you are in the instrument, you'll hear the studio associated with what you're looking at. The only exception to this is when you're sequencing and using an external sequencer instead of the Kurzweil's own song mode. In this case, you should set effects mode to program and effects channel to a specific MIDI channel. We'll cover this example more thoroughly later in the video. Since you will most typically be controlling a studio from a program or setup, we'll explore the studio from within a program. Go to program mode and call up program 199, the default program. Now press edit to enter the program editor, then press the write more button 6 times. Now press the KDFX button. Now let's add an effect to the program. The first parameter on the screen is the studio. A studio is a single object which consists of multiple effects and EQs, plus signal and output routing. We'll be going into great detail in the studio, but first I want to review an easy way to try different effects from the preset studios. Select studio number 1, then take a look at the name. The 2600 has 4 separate effect buses plus a global auxiliary effect. As mentioned previously when covering setups, we have named our preset studios so that you can tell what the various effects are in the studio. In this studio, there is a room reverb on effects bus 1, a chorus on effect bus 2, and the delay on effect bus 3. Effects bus 4 has no effects assigned to it, which is indicated by the space between delay and hall. In all of our preset studios, we have left effects bus 4 set to no effect, so that you always have one dry bus to choose from if you need it. Finally, a hall reverb is assigned as the auxiliary effect. Now, press the left more button 3 times and then press the output soft button. As we did when we edited the setup, if you switch the output setting, you can choose which effect in the current studio that will be used for this layer in the program. Notice the pair parameter is set to KDFX A. One thing that you should understand is that the output pair parameter on this page does not refer to the actual output jacks on the back of the instrument. Instead, it refers to an output which sends the signal out of the synthesizer part of the 2600 and into the effects part of the 2600. All of our preset studios are designed to be as easy to use as possible, so we always have KDFX A going to effects bus 1, KDFX B going to effects bus 2, and so on. Remember that in our studio we had a reverb, a chorus, and a delay. Since our layer is now set to KDFX A, you will hear that room reverb when you play the instrument. Now, switch it to B. When you play, you'll hear a chorus. If we switch it to C, we'll hear a delay. We have not yet heard the auxiliary hall reverb because it's not connected within the studio. But as you can see, it's very easy to try out different effects by picking a studio and then switching layers in the program to various outputs. Now, put the output back to KDFX-A. Now press the right More button 3 times, and then the KDFX button. Select Studio 199, the default studio, and press Edit. You're now in the Studio Editor on the Effects Bus page. We'll explore the studio in the order that the signal flows through it. So press the Input button, and we'll start at the beginning of the studio. The display shows the first part of the signal path of the studio. Notice that in the upper right-hand corner, it says Input A. And there's also an A at the beginning of the signal path. This A corresponds with the output setting of KDFX-A that is chosen in the program editor. Remember previously in this video, we were editing a program and we were able to switch effects by changing the output to A, B, C, or D. What we were actually doing was changing which input we were using going into the studio. To switch inputs, you use the channel bank buttons to the left of the display. Make sure that you have the input set to A and play your keyboard. Notice that the arrow leading from the A to the first EQ flickers. This gives you a visual monitor of when a signal is coming in from that input. If you switch to input B and play, you'll see that the arrow doesn't flicker, showing you that this program has its layers routed to A. This can be very useful if you're playing a program or setup which is using multiple input buses for the different layers of programs, helping you to keep track of where everything is being routed. In the upper left-hand corner of the display, the currently highlighted parameter says SP. This means that this input is set for stereo with panning. You can change it to stereo with balance or to mono. For info on these settings, you should consult your manual. We'll leave it set to stereo with pan. Now, let's look at the signal path itself. The first 2 boxes are the 2 EQs that we talked about before. By highlighting a box, you can choose from several different types of EQ for each of the 2 EQ segments. The Kurzweil offers low and high shelving EQ, a fixed width parameter EQ, a low and high pass filtering. If you have chosen a shelf or a parametric EQ, then you'll see 2 parameters below it. The G is a gain parameter and the F is the frequency. For example, if I set the high shelf frequency to 880 Hertz, then I can boost or cut the frequencies above 880 Hertz by changing the gain. If gain is left at 0 dB, then in essence, you have no EQ, since you are not boosting or cutting any frequencies. If you choose a low pass or high pass, then you will only see a frequency parameter. Any frequencies above or below that parameter, depending on whether you choose low pass or high pass, are cut off. After passing through the two EQs, you can see that the signal is split and sent to two different effects buses. Remember when I described the basic concept of a studio? I said each channel on our pretend mixing board had two effect sends, and that there were four separate effects processors in our pretend rack. These are called effects buses in the Kurzweil. By highlighting these boxes, you can choose which effect buses each input will be routed to. In this case, we see input A is routed to effects bus 1 and effects bus 2. Below each effects bus is a level parameter. This allows you to control how much signal is sent into that effect. The level under the first box is set at 0 dB, which means the signal passes into the effect without any changes. Notice that the level under the second box is set to off. So even though it's possible to send the input to both effect buses, in this case, input A is only being sent to effects bus 1. Now, let's scroll through the inputs with the channel bank buttons and look at the bus assignments. You will see that the level of the second box is set to off, where the effects bus is set to none for all four of the inputs. And if you look at the first box, you'll see that input A goes to effects bus 1. Input B goes to effects bus 2. C goes to 3, and D goes to 4. To make things consistent, this is the way we have programmed all of the preset studios. Of course, you can program the routing any way that you need, but we have stuck with this simple system in the presets to make things as easy as possible for you. As you start switching through the different preset studios, you can always depend on the routing to follow this simple scheme. Now, press the Effects Bus Soft button. This is where you actually choose the effect that you want for each bus. The display tells you which bus you're looking at in the upper right-hand corner, as well as the left side of the signal flow diagram. Once again, you use the channel bank buttons to switch between the buses. Let's assign effects preset 1, nice little booth, to effects bus 1. Again, if you play the keyboard, you'll see that the arrow leading into the effects preset blinks, indicating that the signal is going into the effect. Notice that on the top line, it now says size 1 and free 3. These refer to what we call processing allocation units, or PAUs. Each effect algorithm requires a specific amount of processing power. The more complicated effects require more power and therefore take up more PAUs. There are a total of 4 PAUs that can be split among the 4 effects buses, plus 3 PAUs for the global auxiliary effect. So this means that if you pick an effect which uses more than 1 PAU, at least one of your other effect buses won't be able to have an effect on it. The top line of the display shows you how many PAUs a specific effect uses and how many are left unused after totaling the effects from all 4 buses. Press the Channel Up button to go to Effect Bus 2 and select Effects Preset 135, 8-tap delay. The display shows you this effect uses 2 PAUs. Since we're already using 1 PAU for Effects Bus 1, there's only 1 PAU left, so free is set to 1. Now scroll to Effects Bus 3 and select Effects Preset 176. This uses our last PAU, so now free is set to 0. If you change the effect preset to 177, you'll notice it's in parentheses. This is because this effect uses 2 PAUs, but there's only 1 free. So this effect would not be used, and no effect is called up on this bus. Now, scroll back to Effects Bus 2 and play the keyboard. Notice that you're still hearing the reverb effect, not a delay. And the arrow does not even blink. This is because input B leads into Effects Bus 2, but our program has its output assigned to input A of KDFX. This demonstrates that it's easy to be hearing one thing and looking at something else, based on how you have your signal routed. That is why the blinking arrow is very useful. Now, go back to Effects Bus 1, and we'll look at the rest of the signal path. After going through the effect, the signal can then be sent to an auxiliary effect, or directly to the mix, or both of them. can also be sent directly to an output, which we will discuss in a moment. Just as we saw on the input page, there are level settings for both aux and mix, allowing you to increase or decrease the signal before sending it into that area. Right now, aux level is off, so that no signal is going to the aux effect, and everything goes to the mix. It is also possible to send all of the signal to the aux and set the mix to off. Let's set the level for the aux to 0 dB. I'll press 0 and enter, and leave the mix also at 0 dB. Now, press the aux button. This is where you select the effects preset that is used as the aux effect. Let's call up effects preset 61, Semi-Sweet Hall. One thing to remember about the aux effect is that it is a single global effect. So if you have more than one effects bus set to go into the aux effect, they will all get the same effect added. But since you can set the level of the signal for each effects bus, you can choose how much signal from that bus is sent into the aux effect. Now, play your keyboard. Notice that the arrow once again blinks, showing you signal is coming into the aux effect. You should also notice that your signal is louder now. It is actually twice as loud. Let's look at why this happens. Notice that the signal coming out of the aux effect is going into the mix with the level set at 0 dB. Now, go back to the effects bus page and look at the signal path. You can see that the signal is split when it comes out of the effects bus and sent equally to the aux and the mix. But on the aux page, we also had the signal going back into the mix. So the mix is getting two signals coming into it, one directly from the effects bus with the booth reverb, and also from the aux effect, which includes both the booth and hall reverbs. In other words, it gets twice as much signal, so it's twice as loud. If you want to bring the signal back down, there are several approaches you could take. One way would be to set the level going from the effects bus to the mix to off. This way, the whole signal goes directly through the booth, and then into the hall, and then to the mix. Or, you can lower one or more of the level parameters on this page and the aux page. Obviously, depending on where you choose to lower the level, that will determine on how much reverb you hear in relation to the overall signal. The final way you can lower the level is to bring down the mix level on the output page, which we'll look at next. As you can see, you have a great deal of control over your signal as it passes through various stages in the studio. As you become more familiar with KDFX, we encourage you to experiment with various approaches to signal routing and see what types of end results that you can get. Now, press the output button. This is the final stage of the studio. This is where you determine what you hear coming out of the specific physical out jacks on the 2600. This page also allows you to control the level of the mix. In our current example, we doubled the signal level by having the signal going both to the mix and aux and feeding the aux back into the mix with everything set at 0 dB. To bring the signal back to its original level, we can set the mix level to -3 dB. Now let's look at the output parameters. These outputs correspond to actual pairs of jacks on the 2600. We see that output A is set to mix, and all other outputs are set to off. So all the signals are going to be coming out of the A separate outs or out of the mix outs, and nothing will come out of the other separate outs. We have programmed all of the preset studios in this manner. So if you have the ability to run multiple outputs into your system, you will need to edit the studios for this. Let's look at the various possible values for the outputs. The first possible value is off, which is obviously no output. Next, we see pre-effect 1. This will give you all signals sent to effects bus 1 previous to its running through the effect, but after the EQs and any pan or balance adjustments. Remember that it is possible to assign more than one input to an effects bus, so you could have several signals mixed together. But as we mentioned before, all of our preset studios have each input sent to a different effects bus. So in the case of our preset studios, this will always be the signals coming from input A. Next, we see effects bus 1. As you would expect, this is the signal after it has run through the effect on that bus. Again, it could have signals coming from multiple inputs, but in our preset studios, this will be the signal sent to input A. Next, we have pre-effects and effects bus settings for the other three buses. After that, we have aux effect. This will give you the output of the aux effects bus. Remember that in order to hear a signal with this setting, you would need to send the signal from an effects bus into the aux effects by setting the level to something other than off. Finally, we have mix. Let's talk for a moment about the mix output jacks versus the mix setting on the output page. These are two separate things, but since they're named the same, this can be confusing. Remember that I mentioned at the beginning of the video that all signals will come out of the mix output jacks. This is hardwired into the instrument and requires no programming. In general, you'll probably find it easiest to plug cables into the separate outs using just the A outs if you have only room for two inputs in your mixing board. So, when would you want to use the mix outs? Let's say that you use your 2600 in both a studio and live setting. In this studio, you want to use multiple outputs, and so you edit your studios to route the signals to the different outs. But when you perform live, you might want to keep things as simple as possible and use only two outputs. Instead of having to go back and reprogram all of your studios, you can simply plug into the mix outs, and everything will come out of those two outputs. Go back to the mix value on the output page. This mix has to do with the mixing of the signals from the various effect buses in the studio. Typically, this might be a mix of all four effects buses, but it doesn't have to be. Remember that on the effects bus and the aux effects page, you can determine whether or not the signal is sent into the mix. So you might choose to mix two different effects buses together and send that to one output pair while sending the other effects buses directly to other outputs. As you can see, there are many possibilities for how you might choose to route signals to your output jacks. One way might be to set output A to effects bus 1, output B to effects bus 2, and so forth. But if no output is set to the aux effects or mix, you could never hear the aux effect. Or you could set one of your outputs to aux or mix and set the others to separate effects buses, and then send only certain buses into the aux effect. The best thing is that since this is all programmable per studio, you can make different studios for different needs and quickly switch between them. Once you have your studio configured the way you want it, you can name and save the studio. When you exit out of the studio editor, you'll be back in the program editor with your new studio assigned to the program. Now we'll explore how you can control and change your effect settings when playing a program or setup, or when sequencing. First, we'll take a quick look at the effects themselves. Let's start again in program mode on program 199. Then go into the program editor and go to the KD Effects page. Call up Studio 1 and press Edit. Once again, you're in the Studio editor, and you can see that the bassy room effect is called up on effects bus 1. Now, press Edit again. We call an individual effect an effect preset, and you can see the display shows you are in the effect preset editor. An effect preset consists of a basic effect algorithm plus editable parameters. Different algorithms will have different types of parameters, so the display will change depending what algorithm is chosen. Here we can see this effect uses the mini reverb algorithm, and so we can set such parameters here as the reverb time, pre-delay time, etc. If you press the parameter 2 soft button, you'll see that you can select the room type and other settings. Now, press exit, and then use the channel bank buttons to scroll to effect bus 3. This has the fluid chorus delay reverb. Press edit again. This time the algorithm shows chorus and delay and reverb. Notice, there are now 4 param soft buttons. Depending on complexity of the effect, you'll have different numbers of editable parameters for the effect. If you want to customize the effects, you can edit the parameter here and save new effect presets. But Kurzweil also makes it very easy to change these parameters from outside of the effect preset. And this is what we're going to look at next. Press exit so that you're back in the studio editor. The first type of effects editing you can do outside of the effect preset is called a bus override, or bus mod, and you have 2 of them available for each effect bus, plus 2 for the aux effect. If you look at parameters under effects 3, you will see 2 marked wet, dry, and out gain. If you scroll down, you will see that you can easily change the wet, dry amount, which will override the setting found within the preset. Wet, dry, and out gain are the typical default parameters displayed, but in fact, you can almost override any parameter in the effect preset. If you scroll 1 parameter to the left, you will see that you can change wet, dry to other editable parameters in the effect preset. Notice that as you change the parameter, the value also changes, showing you the current value for that parameter within the preset. You can then scroll back to the value and change it to a new value. As you can see, this gives you the ability to customize a studio without having to edit the individual presets and save them. Now, we will look at the second way of modifying the parameters, which is even more powerful. Press exit, and then no to the Save Changes screen. Now you're back on the KDFX page in the program editor. Notice the parameters below the studio. These are called effects mods. Press the down arrow key, and you should be on the first bus parameter. Virtually every parameter from the studio can be controlled from the program, including input EQ sections, all the effects buses, the aux effect, and the mix levels. Change the bus parameter to the next value. It now says in A. If you scroll 1 parameter to the right, you can now select the various EQ and send parameters found on the Input A page within the studio. Let's set it to EQ2 treble gain. Now let's look at the next 3 columns. The adjust amount will change the fixed amount that was set within the studio. This works in the same way the bus override parameters did in the studio editor. So I could increase the amount of treble EQ by boosting the gain here without having to edit and save the studio. But what is even better is that I can assign real-time control to these EQ settings. Scroll over to the source and set it to controller number 6. This is data. Remember that in the default control setup, slider A is assigned to data. Now scroll over to the depth parameter and set it to 6 dB. Now, as I move the slider up, I boost the amount of treble. Now, scroll down to the next bus parameter and let's look at the possible bus values. In addition to inputs A through D, you'll also see effects 1 through effects 4, plus aux and mix. As you change the selection, the available editable parameters will change. Set the bus to effect 1. Now, when you scroll through the values in the parameter column, you see all of the editable parameters from the Basie Room Effects preset, since that is what's on effect bus 1. Set it to wet dry. Then scroll to the adjust and set it to 0. And now you'll hear no reverb. Now scroll to source. And one nice thing is that you can set several effects mods to the same control source. So you can assign this also to data. Set the depth to 75%. Now as I move the slider up, it boosts the treble, and at the same time, it increases the amount of reverb. Of course, I could set the wet-dry mix to a different slider. If I change it to controller 22, it will be controlled by slider B. Press Edit. This jumps you back into the studio editor. Notice that the wet-dry parameter now says effects mod. This indicates that the wet-dry mix is being controlled by an effects mod from the program. Now press Exit. The KDFX page gives you 3 effects mods, but if you look at the effects mod 2, 3, and 4 pages, you will see that each of them has 5 effects mods on the page, giving you a total of 18 different parameters in the studio that you can control. As you can see, this gives you a tremendous amount of power to control and change your effects. Let's take a look at one more program to see effects mods in action. Let's look again at program 80, Poly Reel Mini. Go into the program edit and scroll to the KDFX page. You can see that the mix level and the treble EQ frequency for input A have been adjusted to set levels, and the EQ treble gain is controlled by controller 24, which is slider D. If you look at the other effect mod pages, you will see that controllers 23 through 29 have been used to control many different aspects of the studio. Controller 23 through 28 correspond with sliders C through H, and controller 29 is switch number 2. Also, on the Effect Mod 4 page, you will see that the delay tempo for the effect on Effect Bus 1 is controlled by System. This means that it will follow a MIDI clock. You can use the Kurzweil's internal clock or sync to an external clock, depending on the setting of the clock parameter in song mode. You'll find the same set of effects mod pages in the setup editor. If you want to use the effect mods when in setup mode, remember that for any real-time control, you will need to assign the controllers to send the specific MIDI controller numbers you assign on the effects mod pages. These controllers must be assigned in zone 1 of the setup. One very useful feature is the ability to import a studio from another program or setup. For example, here's a program that I created which does not yet have effects on it. I have another program I created which has an effect that I want to use on this program. So I go into the program editor and scroll to the Import Effects page. And then I press it. Now I'll call up the program which has the effect I want to import. I can play the keyboard while I'm on this page and hear the studio associated with any program or setup. Once I have the effect I want, I just press Import. One of the best things about using Import is that the Kurzweil not only imports the studio, but it also imports all of the effects mods from the other program or setup. So I don't have to go back and assign all of the controllers in my new program. They're now set the same way as they were in the other program. As you can see, this is a real time saver, and it also allows you to easily grab studios and all their effects mods from our preset programs and setups. Now let's talk about using the effects in a sequence. So far we've seen that each program and setup has its own studio assigned to it. But you can only have one studio active at a time. So once you're sequencing using multiple programs on different channels, you need to be able to choose which studio will be used. In addition, if you're going to change effect settings in real time with sliders or other controllers, then you need to be able to record those controller movements onto a track. For this reason, the best way to work when creating a sequence is to create a special program for controlling the studio. Then use one of your sequence tracks to be used just for effects control. The first thing you do is choose the channel you will use for this track. Go to Song Mode and call up the song you created earlier. I'm going to use an example that I created. Press Edit. On the Common page, you'll see the Effect Channel parameter. You want to choose a channel that you aren't already using for a track. I often use channel 15 because channel 16 is being used for the click. Now exit the editor and save the song. Set your record track to the track that is assigned to the channel. In this case, track 15. Now highlight the program parameter. You can start with any program assigned to this track. It doesn't matter what sounds are in the program, since you won't be using the program to play any notes. Now press Edit. The Kurzweil takes you into the program editor, exactly the same as if you pressed Edit when in program mode. At this point, you can go to the KDFX page and call up the studio you want. Then you can assign any effects mods you want to use. In my case, I already have a program which has the studio and effects mods that I want. So I'll go to Import Effects and import them from my program. Once you have everything set, save and name the program and exit out of the editor. I'll just keep it set to default program. Now you return to the song mode. We need to do one more thing in order to hear the proper effects for each channel, and that is to set the outputs for the programs. Remember that the output settings in the programs are what you use to route the programs into various inputs in the studio. You can edit each program individually to set the output the way you want, but there's also another way to do this which is often easier. Press the MIDI button, then the Channel Soft button. On this page, you'll see a parameter called OutPair. Typically, this parameter will be set to Prog, which means that the output settings within the program will be used. But if you set this parameter to KDFX A, B, C, or D, then you override those settings and you force whichever program is on this MIDI channel to use that output. So you can scroll through each channel with the channel bank buttons and set each channel to the output that you want. I'm going to set channels 1 and 3 to KDFX B and channel 4 to KDFX C. I'm leaving channel 2 set to Prog because my drum program has different layers set to different outputs so that the various drums have different effects. The advantage of using this method is that you don't have to edit and save each program you're using in the song. But these settings are global, so if you have another song and it has different routing, you'll need to change these settings each time you change songs. Once you have set the outputs the way you need, go back to song mode. To make sure the correct studio is always called up when you play the song, record a couple of bars for this track. That will cause the Kurzweil to put the program and bank changes into the track to call up your program. Now, if you want to change effect settings throughout the song, you can use this track to record controller movements that you program as effects mods. Okay, now we'll have some fun and go to our effects track. And I'm prepared now to use the sliders to do some real-time control of our effects. So if I hit record and play, we'll record my actions. Save this because I liked it, replace, and there you have it. So far, I've shown how to assign and control the effects after having recorded my tracks, and I've chosen a studio in which I already knew exactly how everything would sound. But what if you need to be able to audition effects for a track while you're working on the song? I'm going to show you a trick which will make this easy to do. Remember that we have track 15 set to control the effects. So in order to change the effects I have in the studio, I will set the record track to 15, then highlight the program parameter, and press Edit. This jumps me into the program editor, and I can scroll to the KDFX page and press Edit again to go into the studio editor. So now I can change the effect assigned to each bus. But when I play the keyboard, I hear the program assigned to track 15. But what I need to hear are the programs that are being used in my song. So now what I can do is press the Mix Down button. If you have a rack, you can still get to this page by pressing the Clear button. Now, as I highlight a track on this page, the keyboard changes the MIDI channel that it's transmitting on, so I can hear each program. I want to change the effect I have for the lead sound in my song. So I'll scroll to that track as I've done. Now I press Exit. The screen returns me back to the studio editor, but I'm still transmitting on channel 4 instead of channel 15. So when I play, I can hear my lead sound instead of the program on channel 15. I know track 4 is set to KDFX C, so I'll scroll to Effects Bus C. Now I can change the effect and hear what it sounds like with my lead sound. Once I've found the effect I want, I can press Exit and save my studio. Then I press Exit again to jump out of the program editor, and I'm back in the song mode. Notice that when I play the keyboard, I'm back to hearing the program on channel 15 instead of my lead sound on channel 4. For those of you who use an external sequencer, you can still use the same concept of creating a special program to call up your studio and record a track of controller information for your effects mods. There's only one thing you need to set differently. When using the Kurzweil song mode, you choose the channel you will use for effect control within the song editor. But if you're using an external sequencer, that parameter does not apply. In this case, the solution is to go to the main effects page. Set effects mode to program. Then set effects channel to the specific channel you want to use for effects control. Now you can go ahead and create a program for effects control in the exact same way and call it up on your chosen channel. Once you start creating your own programs and samples, you're going to want to start saving them to disk. Let's take a moment and talk about memory. There are two kinds of RAM memory in the 2600, sample RAM and PRAM. Sample RAM is used only for actual sample data, whether it's samples you make yourself or that you load from disk. If you have the sampling version of the 2600, your unit comes with 4 meg of sample RAM. If you have the basic unit, you have no sample RAM. Either way, you can expand your unit up to 128 meg using SIMs. This type of memory is volatile. That is, when you turn the unit off, the samples will be lost, making it necessary to save them to disk before turning the unit off. The other type of RAM, PRAM, is used to hold all objects except for the actual samples. This type of RAM is battery-backed. However, it is always a good idea to back up your data by saving it to disk anyway. Press the Disk Mode button. the current disk parameter is highlighted. If you have not changed this from the factory default, it will be set at floppy. You can use this parameter to select either the floppy drive or a SCSI drive. Each device in a SCSI chain needs to have its own separate ID. There are 8 possible IDs, numbered between 0 and 7. The default number for the 2600 is 6. If you're planning on hooking your 2600 up to a SCSI drive, we recommend that you read the SCSI information in the manual. SCSI has several rules that need to be followed, or you can end up with corrupt data. For now, we'll be working with the floppy drive, so set the current drive to floppy. Take a double density or high density disk and put it in the drive. Make sure the Write Protect tab is in the down position. The K2600 uses a DOS format for its floppy disks. If you have a disk pre-formatted for DOS, you can save to it without formatting. Otherwise, you must format the disk. Press one of the More buttons till you see Format and press it. Answer yes, and you will be asked whether to format to a 720K or 1.4 meg. Double density disks are 720K and high density disks are 1.4 meg. You should always format the disk for the appropriate size. If you try and format a double density disk for 1.4, it will fail the formatting process. Press yes on the next couple of screens and the formatting process starts. For those of you working with a SCSI drive, the process is basically the same. However, you will not be given the choice of size to format the drive. The 2600 will format it for the appropriate size. There are a couple of things to know about formatting SCSI. If you are using an optical drive, make sure to use a cartridge that is formatted for 512 bytes per sector instead of 1024 bytes per sector. The second thing is that the 2600 does not format SCSI devices in fully implemented DOS, as it does with floppy disks. However, the 2600 can read and write to DOS-formatted SCSI drives. So those of you with a computer may want to format the drive for the computer. Then you can hook up the drive to either the PC or the 2600. The 2600 has a limit of 2 gigs for the drive size. If you have a larger drive and format it from the 2600, it will be formatted for 2 gig. If you format your drive from the PC, make sure to make the first partition 2 gig or less, since the K2600 only sees the first partition. The other partitions can still be used by the PC. Next, we'll talk about directories. You can group files on disk together within a directory, also known as a folder to Macintosh users. Grouping files by directory is extremely useful for organizing your sounds and songs, especially if you have a large hard drive. You can even put directories within other directories, just like on a computer. This is known as hierarchical file system. Press the Write More button and select New Directory. You are then asked to name the directory. The name can be up to 8 characters and follows DOS naming standards. This screen looks similar to the naming screen for objects, but 2 of the soft buttons are different. The 2 arrow buttons are replaced. You can still move the cursor by using the left and right arrow buttons to the right of the display. The End soft button moves the cursor to the last character. The Choose button will display a list of names of files already on the disk. This can be useful if you're naming a series of directories with similar names. You can pull the name off the disk without having to retype it, and then modify it. We'll name our directory Video. Next, the 2600 will ask you if you want to use the current directory for the file. Since this is our first directory, just press OK. The 2600 creates a directory and returns you to disk mode. Now we're ready to save a file. For all disk operations, there are 2 methods you can use. One is the bank method, and the other is the object method. The object method will allow you to save and load individual objects. We'll start with the bank method, since it's simpler. Press the Write More button and select Save. Notice there are different banks of 100. If you scroll down, you will also see Everything, which saves everything in RAM, and Master, which saves all the global and MIDI parameters. When you choose a bank to save, it will save all types of objects in that bank. An asterisk after the bank indicates that there are objects in that bank. Let's look at the soft buttons on this page. Pressing Export gives you the opportunity to save a file in other formats besides the Kurzweil format. AIFF and WAV are two different sample formats. MIDI stands for a standard MIDI file, which is a standard format for sequences. Once you have selected your format, the K2600 will display any objects that would apply to that format. Since we have neither samples or songs in memory at this point, the display shows nothing. Press Cancel, then Save again. The Object Soft button allows you to use the object method of saving. We'll be showing this method later. The New Directory Soft button performs the same feature found on the Disk Mode page. It is also placed here so you can create a new directory to save a file without having to exit the Save page. We'll save the 200s bank, since that is where we saved the program we created. Once 200 through 299 is highlighted, press OK. Once again, we see the naming page. We'll name our file Dream and press OK to save it. Next, the 2600 asks which directory we wish to save in and shows the current directory. In this case, it's the root directory, which is the top level of the disk hierarchy. This is indicated by the backslash with no other directory names. We want to save the file in our video directory, so press Change. The top line of the display shows that we are in the root directory. The display shows all directories and files found within the current level. In this case, there's only one directory. The three soft buttons on the left side will help you navigate through the directories. Since you can have directories placed within other directories, these buttons allow you to move up and down through the hierarchy. The root button takes you immediately to the top level. The parent button moves you back up one level, and the open button shows you the directories within the current directory. Pressing Current will save the file to the current root level directory. If you want to save the file within the video directory, press Set Directory button. The file is then saved. Now, let's load a file into the 2600. For this example, we'll load a file from one of the disks that came with your 2600. This disk is marked Demos. Put the disk in the drive and press Load. The 2600 looks at the disk and will display all the files and directories in the root level directory. You want to take some time exploring the files on this disk. There's a directory full of demo sequence files. Scroll down until you see the file marked Video. This time we'll use the Object method to load individual objects. Press Open. The 2600 reads the file and will display all the objects in the file. You can select individual objects to load. Simply scroll till that object is highlighted and press Select. An asterisk will appear next to the name indicating it's been selected. You can scroll through all the objects and select as many as you want this way. Once you've selected objects, you may want to double-check the items you have selected. Pressing the Next soft button will jump you to the next selected item in the list. If you have different types of objects in the file, pressing the Type soft button will jump you to the first object for each type in the list. Another way to select objects is by using the Multi-soft button. Pressing this button gives you a new screen which will allow you to select objects by various criteria. If the Select parameter is set to Type Range, you can select various types of objects within a selected range of IDs. For example, you could choose to load only programs with IDs between 200 and 250. The All, Type, and Toggle and Clear soft buttons will help you in quickly selecting or deselecting groups of objects. There are also other settings for the Select parameter. Check your manual for a detailed description of these features. Once you have chosen the objects you wish to be selected, press the Set Soft button. You will be returned to the Object Load page, and you'll see that the objects you choose now have an asterisk, indicating that they have been selected. Now, press OK. You'll then be asked which bank you want to load the objects into. Let's pick the 200 bank. Next, a group of soft buttons appear which allow you to pick the method the 2600 will use to load the objects. If you started with an empty bank, you'll see only Append and Fill. Since we started with a bank that already contained objects, we also see Overfill, Overwrite, and Merge. Each of these methods will load in the objects to different locations depending on what is in the file and what is already in that bank. For a complete description of the differences between the various choices, consult your manual. For now, we'll choose Append. The 2600 loads the objects and returns to disk mode. If you go to Program mode and scroll through the bank, you'll see the objects you chose. Disk mode also gives you other tools for manipulating files and directories. You can delete or rename them. You can move them from within one directory to another. You can also copy individual files or backup directories from one disk to another. These features work in much the same manner as loading and saving, so you can consult the manual if you have any further questions on that. You will also find a soft button marked Utilities. In this window, you can check the amount of free space on your current disk, list the files in various directories, or find a file or directory by using a search string. Another feature of disk mode is the ability to create macros. Macros allow you to automate loading multiple files. Once you create the macro, you simply load the macro, and it will go and load the various files that you have specified. You can even create a boot macro, which will load automatically each time you turn the instrument on. For details on these features, you should check out your manual. Kurzweil is well known for supporting and updating our instruments for years after they're released. One of the great things about the 2600 is that the operating system is on flash ROM. This means that as we release updates to the operating system, you can easily download them from our website and install them in your instrument. So be sure to check out our website on a regular basis for new versions of the operating system. You can check the version of the OS in your unit simply by turning it on and watching the display. The version number is displayed during the power-up process. There are several options which you can add to your 2600. Some of these options are user installable. If you look on the bottom of your instrument, you'll see 8 screws attaching a removable panel to the instrument. When you remove those screws and take off the panel, you will see a circuit board with various slots on it. One of these slots holds the PRAM option, which will increase the amount of battery-backed RAM. This RAM is used for holding everything that you can name and save into memory except for samples. Next to the PRAM slot are 2 slots for holding sample RAM. The K2600 uses standard 72-pin SIMs for holding samples. SIMs are not battery-backed, so you must save your samples to disk before you turn off your unit, or the samples will be erased. The K2600 can hold up to 128 meg of sample RAM. Also, on this board are 4 slots for holding ROM expansion options. These ROM options add additional samples, programs, and setups. Currently, there are 2 ROM blocks, contemporary and orchestral. each of which adds 8 meg of ROM samples with 100 programs and 50 setups. 2 additional ROM blocks will be released in the future. Also, on this board is a lithium disk battery for the battery-backed RAM, which can be replaced when the battery runs low. There are several other options for the K2600 which must be installed by an authorized service center. You can add an internal SCSI hard drive. If you purchased a 2600 without sampling, you can add it with a sampling option. Finally, the KDS option adds the ability to output or input 8 channels of digital audio to Kurzweil's digital multitrack interface, or even to another K2600. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it to be both helpful and informative. So now, sit down in front of your instrument, start playing, and have some fun.